Good morning, everyone. We're just going to let participants join and we'll get started in about a minute. Okay, good morning, everyone. We are really excited about today's webinar. This is a very timely topic. For those of you who are joining, I guess you agree. My name is Sarah Stewart. I am the CEO of Silverado Policy Accelerator. We are a nonprofit geopolitical think tank here in Washington, D.C. We focus a lot of our work on critical supply chains, and part of that is looking at trade trends and different types of policy measures. So over the last year, we've seen a lot of news about China's buildup of electric vehicle capacity and a resulting surge in exports. We know that China has the highest proportion of electric vehicle exports among the top 5 exporters of EVs in 2023, and by a very substantial amount. This is a competitiveness issue for automakers in the US and in our allied partner countries. We've already seen the EU taking action by commencing a subsidy investigation to determine if countervailing duties will be imposed on Chinese electric vehicle exports to the EU market. While the US has not faced the same surge as the EU, Chinese exports to the US are growing, and there is increasing concern about what this will mean for US production and US jobs. Last week, the White House released a statement that Chinese automakers are seeking to flood autos in the US and globally, posing new threats to our national security, and that President Biden will not let that happen. The statement included a focus on the security risks of imported connected vehicles from China and other countries of concern, and the US is in the process now of collecting information about those risks through an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. We have an opportunity, the collective we, to identify and solve for some of these risks that are present from both surging exports as well as data security risks. But we must act quickly and we must be well informed. So today, the Silverado team and our esteemed colleagues at the ITC are going to look specifically at the data and the trends to help inform this debate. We are very honored to be joined by David Coffin and Jeff Walling today, and I'm going to turn it over to our Vice President of Industry and Analysis, Andy David, to help kick us off. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Sarah. It is my pleasure to welcome two friends and former colleagues at the U.S. International Trade Commission, David Coffin and Jeff Walling. David and Jeff have each worked at the ITC for over a decade, with much of that time spent studying the auto industry and auto supply chains. They have numerous publications on the auto industry on the ITC's website, available at www.usitc.gov. If you have any questions for David and Jeff during the presentation, please add them into the chat and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, the USITC is an independent, nonpartisan agency, so David and Jeff won't be able to provide any recommendations on U.S. policy. We are recording the webinar and it will be available on the Silverado website after the presentation. The slides will also be posted on the Silverado website. In addition, Silverado also recently posted several dashboards on passenger vehicle trade, which are available on our website at silverado.org. I'll now turn it over to David to get us started.
Thanks, Andy. As Andy just mentioned, my name is David Coffin. Jeff and I are going to be talking to you today about Chinese EV trade and reasons for growth. Before we get started, a few things to talk about the ourselves. As Andy mentioned, we are economists from the Office of Industry and Competitiveness Analysis at the ITC. Jeff is a newly promoted supervisory economist and my boss now, and I am a senior international economist. I guess we've already talked about that we do trade policy analysis, and Jeff and I cover the automotive industry. What we're talking about today is coming from a forthcoming article in the Journal of International Commerce and Economics, which is the ITC's internal peer-reviewed journal. The views expressed here today are our own and not necessarily those of the commission or any of its commissioners. Next slide, please. Some key terms to go over for today. When we're talking about electric vehicles, we are talking about battery electric vehicles, those with only an electric motor and no gasoline engine. Sometimes people use EV to refer to both battery electric and plug-in hybrid. In this presentation, we won't be doing that. And also when we say vehicles, we mean all on-road vehicles, with the exception of motorcycles. So we're going from small cars all the way up to large trucks and buses, and that's unless otherwise mentioned, that's what the data is covering. Quick roadmap, big picture roadmap. I'm going to talk about the Chinese EV industry and then begin the discussion on how Chinese EV exports to the EU have grown so rapidly. And then Jeff's going to take over the second half of the reasons for the Chinese EV exports to the EU, followed by looking at the potential for exports coming to the United States, including both a retrospective look and a more prospective look at a couple different cases and how things could look. So diving into the Chinese EV industry, I'm going to first talk to you a little bit about how EV production has increased. There's really a long history of the promotion of electric vehicles in China. The research was promoted all the way back in the 80s, the 863 program in the 90s, and then the NEV policy of 2009 was the first real, I think it was the 2009 one that was the first real national promotion of production and sales, followed by the Made in China 2025 policy, and then now there's policy through 2035. So with that increase in production, exports have followed, and we've also seen an increase in the quality of the vehicles, and those two things are really intertwined. Countries can control their domestic market and really create competition domestically, not create competition, create a market domestically for vehicles produced in country. But in order to export, you actually have to have something that other countries want to buy. And so it's really the last couple of years where Chinese EVs have gone from something that they're selling domestically to something that is really competitive internationally. And batteries have shown a similar trend, which I'll talk about a little bit as well. So a little bit of big picture before we dive into Chinese EV production. Next slide, please. You can see here comparing other major markets that China is the leader in EV sales. They're the leader in production, and they're the leader in exports. However, their export share, this was 2022, is small relative to the EU, Japan, and South Korea. Very similar numbers in 2023, a little higher export share for China as the exports increased, which we'll talk about in a minute. But both China and the United States much more domestically focused in our vehicle production and our EV production. Next slide, please. Here you can see Chinese EV production really took off in 2020. Before then, it had been under 1 million units for a long time, which, by the way, still more than anyone else was making at the time, but not a very large part of Chinese production, which was more like 26 to 30 million vehicles per year. So now it's becoming a larger part of Chinese vehicle production. And next slide, please. It's also a larger part of trade. You can see takeoff occurs in 2020 for the EV exports as well. And it not only were exports increasing, but exports as a share of vehicle exports really shot up. You can see that leveling off from 2022 to 2023. That's not because EV exports weren't growing. It's because exports of internal combustion engine vehicles, primarily to Russia, which some of you may have seen highlighted in Silverado's dashboard about trade with Russia, has really increased. I think that's a relatively short-term thing, but I think it has helped raise awareness of Chinese increased competitiveness to have that additional bump in there, so that China's right near the top in terms of total vehicles exported in overall, not just EVs. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the increase, I mentioned the increase in quality. There's a few different ways you can see the increase in quality. First is in the diversification and increased wealth of the destinations. So on the left, you can see the top 5 destinations in 2018, which in some ways doesn't look that similar if you're just looking top 5 to top 5. You know, on the left, you have 3 high-income countries. On the right, you have 3 high-income countries. And so you're trading a lower middle income country for an upper middle income country. However, if you dig a little deeper into the data, 70% of the EVs exported in 2018 were to Bangladesh. And so that was really a huge part of what was happening then. And as we aggregated all of the trade data together, so you could see all of the exports by income level of destination country, and that's where you can really see that high income is the driver. You know, exports to high income countries are really the driver of this increase in exports, with over 60% of EV exports each of the last 3 years from China going to high income countries. Another way you can look at this, next slide, please, is by looking at the unit price of those exports. In 2018 and 2019, the unit price was less than $5,000. I don't actually know exactly what those vehicles were. I think it could have been 3-wheeled vehicles or glorified golf carts, neighborhood electric vehicles. It's not in 2018 and the first 11 months of 2019, it wasn't Teslas, it wasn't BYDs, it was something else that was getting exported. But you see, starting in 2020, you know, that unit price is really taking off, and it's taking off because the quality of the vehicles being exported is increasing rapidly. A little bit of context of that 23,000 number that you see for 2023 looks really good here. It is significantly cheaper than the unit price of US EV exports, which is more like $52,000. So significantly more expensive, still not necessarily the same price range as the EVs produced in the United States. Next slide, please. But you can see here, I chose a few vehicles primarily from brands that you all aren't familiar with. You know, we could have put a Tesla Model 3 in here. We could have put a BYD Dolphin, which you all may have heard of, BYD, because they're one of the more successful brands. But these are a number of other Chinese brands, some startups, some more longer term brands, and they're producing and exporting EVs really across the different levels of vehicle. You have, you know, at the bottom right, you have a small performance-oriented EV, you know, and then you've got a large car, you have a mid-size SUV, you have a small SUV, well, probably CUVs, but anyway, it's a whole variety of vehicles that are being exported and produced and exported by Chinese manufacturers. Next slide, please. And the story is pretty similar when you look at lithium-ion batteries. China has long been the largest producer of lithium-ion batteries. And for the domestic market, they have always been the provider of batteries for those EVs. But only in recent years have you seen an increase in the exports of those batteries and the increased share, which is actually still below their share of production. China's share of EV battery production's more like 75% or higher, and they're just over 50% of the battery exports. And however, those manufacturers, primarily CATL and BYD, have not only do they continue to supply the domestic market, they're also supplying major US and European manufacturers. You all may have heard about Ford's licensing agreement with CATL, Tesla working with BYD, and both CATL and BYD have additional deals with major vehicle manufacturers. So it's really reflective of the standard and quality that's now being produced. The battery is the most important part of the vehicle, and international manufacturers are starting to purchase Chinese batteries, which shows that they believe in the quality of those batteries, because if the quality of the battery is bad, then the EV is not going to look good. And so yeah, it's really reflective of that quality. Next slide, please. So turning towards Chinese EV exports to Europe, we're going to start off, next slide, by talking about the Tesla plant in Shanghai. And then we're going to go into some EU versus US market differences. You know, they sell a little more in the EU and a little more EVs. And there's some differences that we think made the EU a little more open. And then you have to talk about the development of the Chinese EV manufacturers. We already mentioned it a little bit, but that increased quality and the loosened JV requirements allowed for foreign, I say foreign, even though foreign is sometimes the US, sometimes the EU in China, manufacturers to actually export and profit more from production in China. And then, you know, I mentioned those programs earlier, that there have been long-running programs to support EV development, production, and sales. So turning to the Tesla plant in Shanghai, I think this is certainly a very big part of the story when it comes to China's exports. In 2019, with the loosening of the joint venture requirements, Tesla opened the first wholly foreign-owned EV factory in Shanghai, and it has a massive capacity of 750,000 units, which most plants, it's more like 300, 400,000 units. Some are as small as 150,000 units. So 750,000 is very big. And Tesla has used that capacity to meet demand in China and the EU. You can not only see this in the China export data that we've been talking about, you can also see it in the US export data, because before 2019, particularly before 2020, because the plant opened at the end of 2019, so it didn't have a huge impact in 2019 data. But starting in 2020, US EV exports actually went down. And a big reason why they went down is not because the US was producing fewer EVs or because of some sort of quality issue with US EVs. It was that Tesla, which produces a full range of EVs in the United States, started supplying Model 3s from Shanghai instead of from the United States to the EU. And then they also opened a Model Y plant in Germany. So that's two of the then 4, now 5 consumer-facing EVs that Tesla produces that were no longer coming from the United States. And those are the higher selling ones. The S and the X still only made in the US. But Tesla makes up a huge percentage of those EV exports. CSIS reported that it was 39% in the first half of 2023, which is a very large percentage. But honestly, you know, even you take away that 39%, and China is still likely the leader when it comes to EV exports. So Tesla is a big part of the story. It is certainly not the only part of the story. And for more on Chinese exports to the EU, I'm going to pass it to Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks everyone for coming, as David said. So turning to the other two reasons that David outlined, I think the first one that we should talk about is why the EU, and specifically, why not the United States? And the answer is there's some real differences in terms of the two markets that make Chinese exports to the EU more logical in terms of a starting place. The first thing to touch on briefly is that Tesla already has significant US production. And the key difference there that David was just talking about is, again, about the models that we're talking about. Because an observant listener might say, well, you just pointed out that there was also a plant in Europe, so reconcile these things for me. What's going on here is that what's being produced at the European Gigafactory is a different model of vehicle than what's being produced at the Shanghai Gigafactory. So the European market is supplied its vehicles via those two different facilities. Whereas when you talk about US demand for Teslas, the two factories that they have producing vehicles in the United States, one in Fremont, California, and one in Austin, Texas, combined to produce the entire fleet of Teslas, whether you want a Model X, a Model S, a Model 3, a Model Y, or a Cybertruck. You can get that from supply of production in the United States, and that's just not true of the European Union. So that's an important distinction that's Tesla dependent. But then the other two factors, which I'll go into in more detail in the next two slides, are one, that EV demand in totality is simply lower in the United States right now. And that's going to have a role on how dependent we are on export or imports rather, not only from China, but just from any country. And then lastly, there's a significant difference in terms of tariffs paid to import vehicles from China, EV or not, right now compared to the European Union. And we shouldn't just ignore that when looking at the ability for Chinese manufacturers to export to the United States potentially in the future. But looking first at the demand side of the equation, so this is US and EU EV sales over a 6-year time horizon. And there's a pretty clear picture of what's going on here. In 2018, the first year of the data, US sales of electric vehicles actually outpaced those of Europe. But that flips in 2019 and then is pretty consistent from 2020 onward. Each year from 2020 to 2023, you're talking about a 300 to 400,000 unit gap between US sales and EU sales. While the US is increasing over that time frame, and you could say, Jeff, demand is picking up, the reality is like the gap is just not getting bridged. And I think one way of thinking about this moving forward is for as long as US production can keep up with that demand side of the equation, it's plausible to assume that there would be very little importing of electric vehicles into the US market. The one exception to that is Mexico. There's a variety of vehicles that are produced there. And I think that's a situation where previously NAFTA, but now USMCA facilitates the interlinkaging of that particular supply chain in a way that we maybe just wouldn't see in terms of other major vehicle manufacturers, whether it's China or even Germany, Japan, South Korea, etc. And then the second thing, going back to the tariffs, so for anyone who doesn't know, kind of just a brief overview of tariff rates across countries, most countries have what's called an MFN rate, which is the typical tariff that you would pay importing a vehicle. And on most automotive goods, I say most because this is only looking at passenger vehicles, so the tariff rate on, say, pickup trucks is different. But for cars or SUVs, the United States actually has a lower MFN rate than the European Union. However, 6-7 years ago now, during the Trump administration, the United States imposed what are called Section 301 tariffs on a variety of Chinese goods. This is not automotive specific, but automotive goods are one of the products covered. And for most of the products covered by Section 301, the United States is currently imposing an additional 25% tariff on the importation of any of those Chinese goods. So right now, as things currently stand, if you have the exact same Chinese electric vehicle, a US importer would pay a 27.5% tariff, whereas a European importer would only pay a 10% tariff. That's a 2.5 times difference. I mean, that's a significant deterrent in terms of deciding whether or not you want to import a Chinese vehicle, all else equal, and is something that I often think that the media isn't necessarily accounting for when talking about how realistic the importing of a Chinese vehicle specifically, setting aside potential Chinese investments in the US market. But when we're talking about imports, the Section 301 tariff is a pretty big barrier to overcome. And then the last of kind of the three main reasons for exports to the EU that David had outlined is just the brands that are currently operating in China that are exporting to the European Union. And we think there's some unique characteristics there that maybe also explains why we haven't seen them in the United States yet. You can typically group these into three different categories. So you have existing Chinese brands like BYD, like Aura, like MG and Row that are maybe just more recognized and more existent in the EU market previously. In the case of BYD, those vehicles have been there for a pretty long time now. Aura is a lesser known brand in terms of brand recognition, but it's the EV arm of Great Walls Motors, which is a more established Chinese brand. And then lastly, MG and Row are now subsidiaries of SAIC, but they were actually both originally British companies. So again, there's an existing EU brand recognition component there. The second grouping is what I'm going to kind of call Chinese-owned startup brands like Awe, Neo, and Xiaopeng. And in this case, I think it's a little more of an open question about why these new companies that don't have the same existing brand recognition, why the EU has been their primary destination so far instead of the US market. I again would maybe say that tariffs are potentially a large part of that. But I think there you could say, okay, like Jeff, if there isn't the existing brand recognition, why not aim for both markets at the same time? So if I had to kind of pick who might be most likely to come, that certainly factors into that decision. And then lastly, the reality is we've talked a lot about Tesla in this presentation already, but there's other existing European brands specifically that not only have operations in China, but also have begun exporting since the loosening of those JV requirements that David mentioned earlier. It's now possible to have a joint venture in China that is not primarily owned by the Chinese side of the JV, which was not previously the case. And two of those companies, specifically BMW and Renault, are now both exporters, which is something that was not the case prior to the loosening of those requirements. In BW's case, the JV is a company known as BW Brilliance and is a 25-75 JV, but BMW is on the 75% of that, whereas the Chinese partner is only a 25% owner. In Renault's case, it's a 50-50 split, but Renault has the controlling 50% interest. So again, those are just not that BMW isn't also in the United States, but you're talking about two European headquartered companies. And in the case of Renault, another manufacturer that we don't typically see on road in the United States. That being said, I don't think we should just talk about Chinese involvement in the European Union as being all sunshine and rainbows. Sarah alluded to this at the beginning, but in October of 2023, the EU announced that it was opening an anti-subsidy investigation into the Chinese electric vehicle industry. Just kind of a brief overview. These are similar in nature to the US countervailing duty cases that we deal with in US trade policy for anyone who's familiar with those. But to kind of give a brief overview for everyone else, the case was launched ex officio, which means that the European Commission initiated the case itself instead of in response to industry appeal, which is the more typical way in which these types of cases are opened. Again, much like the US countervailing duty or anti-dumping investigations. The case is being based on what is legally called the threat of injury rather than already documented harm. And the European Commission says that this is in an effort to avoid a repeat of Europe's experience with a solar panel investigation about a decade ago, where despite the European Commission eventually taking up the case and ruling in the affirmative for the European industry, the domestic industry was still harmed and still struggles to recover, again, in the words of the European Commission. So kind of what does this mean for the Chinese industry? Well, cases like this typically take about a year. I looked as recently as yesterday, and there isn't a whole lot in terms of an update. But the European Commission will ultimately need to prove three things. One, that exporters of Chinese-made cars received countervailable subsidies from the Chinese government specifically. Second, that Europe's industry is under imminent threat of injury. And then third, that there exists some causal link between those first two things. If they are able to find each of those three things, and if they do rule in the affirmative, then there would be countervailing duties placed on Chinese imports, again, similar to the mechanic of US Section 301. Those tariffs can range in terms of how large they would be, but it is worth noting that they're typically lower than anti-dumping tariffs, which is the other major policy recommendation or policy mechanism that the European Commission would have at its disposal. You might ask, why then? Why use one versus the other? Anti-dumping cases are typically best applied to more basic products like raw materials, for example. So that's one reason why they may have picked the countervailing or sorry, the anti-subsidy investigation, what we call countervailing duties in the United States. And then the other thing to know is, historically speaking, anti-subsidy tariffs, countervailing duties are typically lower than anti-dumping duties. So for now, at least, the European Commission has chosen what might be the less less severe of the two policy options available to them. But then lastly, I'll wrap up with just a brief rundown of kind of what David and I see as maybe being possible implications for the United States. And to start, I think it's important to kind of go back and look at history a little bit. So this graph is just a time series of other Asian manufacturers entering the US market. And there's kind of two main stories to look at. One, Japan entered back in 1958, but it took almost 20 years for them to get a 10% market share. Similarly, Korea took even longer. They entered in 1986, but didn't reach 10% until 2022. And even in that, there's a lot of discourse out there about whether or not that would have even happened if not for the pandemic, or if some of the shifts in supply chain, chip shortage, things like that facilitated that happening a few years faster than it otherwise would have. So I think in both of those cases, you can look at it and say, just because someone wishes to be involved in a new market doesn't mean that it happens overnight. And it could, in fact, take decades. The other two instances may be worth mentioning. One, VinFast, which is a Vietnamese automotive manufacturer, is currently building a $4 billion factory in North Carolina that it hopes to have online sometime in 2024. So that will be the newest entrant into the US market by an Asian manufacturer. And then in terms of China, while there's a lot of discourse right now about Chinese companies having this revitalized interest in the US market, David and I just think it's worth noting that these plans have been being announced for nearly 2 decades at this point. Not to say that it's not more true now than it was previously, but you can find announcements of Chinese firms saying that they're moving to the United States dating back to the mid-2000s. In terms of what's actually happening right now, Polestar is a Chinese-made automobile that's currently exported to the United States. Sarah mentioned at the start of this that there is some of that already occurring. Fun fact, there's one in the ITC garage. I don't know who drives it, but I've looked at it a few times and been really interested in finding out. And Polestar is also a joint venture with Volvo, and there's some announcements that they're going to begin producing Polestar vehicles at Volvo's South Carolina facility sometime this year. So there is at least some US production that is going to be coming online soon, and some vehicles on road. But I would say that the average person, still may not even be aware of what a Polestar is or where it's from or things like that. So we're definitely still talking about small volume. In terms of what China is doing, or has definitely put forth, there's a lot of Chinese automotive investment in Mexico. There's 3 vehicle manufacturing plants currently in operation. It's worth noting that only one of those sells to consumers. The other 2 are commercial vehicles. But nonetheless, there are 3 vehicle operations in Mexico that are Chinese companies. Additionally, there's been 16 different announcements with regards to North America in 2023 alone, and 14 of those are in Mexico. They total about $8.5 billion and are primarily automotive parts, not assembled vehicles. But again, a significant presence forthcoming in Mexico, assuming that the announcements are realized. And then lastly, there's rumors of various vehicle deals in Mexico as well. I say rumors because they are not formal announcements. When Silverado posts the slides later, you're welcome to click this link, but it'll take you to a recent Financial Times article that does a pretty good job of cataloging a series of announcements by different Chinese companies looking to set up operations in Mexico in the coming years. That being said, while all of this maybe, again, sounds very large in magnitude, and I don't want to say that it's not, it's worth noting that Chinese investment in Mexico over the last 4 or 5 years, while very large, still trails behind Germany, Japan, and even the United States. So again, just some order of magnitude here. Like, is it larger than it used to be? Absolutely. Are they the largest player in the country? No. So finally, kind of tying all that together and adding a little bit more flavor, David and I are going to conclude with kind of what we see as the two possible paths forward for China in terms of potential involvement in the United States. I think you can think of these as like a bearish case and a bullish case, but starting with the bearish outcome, I think you'd point to things like the amount of time it took for Japan and Korea to successfully enter the US market and then acquire a significant market share. I think you'd again say Chinese companies have been announcing this for a long time, and only time will tell if these announcements are more likely to be actual than the ones that were happening in the mid 2000s. And then lastly, going back to something I said at the beginning of my half of the presentation, I think as long as Section 301 tariffs are a part of the discussion, the ability to export from China is severely hindered. That doesn't mean that you can't invest in the United States or invest in Mexico, but exporting a vehicle at 27.5% is a significant barrier. On the more bullish side of the equation, I think you could start with the idea that if these investments in Mexico are realized, that's certainly one way to have a point of entry that is not Section 301 dependent and would be a pretty big change to the landscape of the US automotive industry and whether or not China could participate in it. Another simple fact is the US market across industries. This isn't automotive dependent, but in general, we're more welcoming towards imports now than we were a couple decades ago. And maybe you would say that, Japan or Korea's experiences are no longer indicative of what a new entrant's experience would be. Similarly, the Chinese automotive industry is a lot larger now than Korea or Japan were at that point. And maybe you'd say lessons learned and just orders of magnitude mean that they will be able to acquire market share at a faster rate. Last couple EVs, maybe they are the unique point of entry themselves. As David mentioned, China is a disproportionately large producer of batteries and a holder of various upstream parts of the EV supply chain. So maybe that's the reason why they're able to kind of buck the historical trend, for lack of better words. And then I think you could flip Section 301 on its head and say that maybe it's artificially depressed Chinese entrants, and that should the policy end, again, I can't speculate on whether or not that actually would happen, but if the policy were to end, would we see some sort of accelerated rate of entry that might have happened by now, if not for the imposition of those tariffs? And then lastly, and we specifically have a question mark around this because David and I are only beginning to wrap our heads around it, but there's some recent news surrounding the changes to the US's duty drawback laws. And it appears that for vehicle manufacturers who are producing in the United States some models for export and then importing other models, that you, at a rate of 1-to-1, can claw back the tariff that you paid on the imported good. And that has potential ramifications, again, like if there was a situation like Tesla Shanghai versus Tesla Europe, where you're importing one model and exporting the other, that could potentially be another way in which the Section 301 tariffs are less of a factor than they have been up to date. Last, and then we'll turn it over to questions. This is just a short list of various other research topics related to either critical minerals or the EV supply chain or the Chinese automotive industry that David, myself, the other automotive analyst, Simon Adhanom, as well as our colleagues in our natural resources division at the ITC have done in recent years on this topic or interrelated ones. We just kind of always like to end with this for anyone who's interested in reading up more on the topics. Again, all of these links will take you to the publications once Silverado puts up the slides afterwards. So we encourage everyone to have a look at these as well. And with that, I will turn it back over to Andy and Sarah for questions.
Great. Thanks, Jeff and David. Please, everyone, go ahead and ask questions in the chat if you have them. I know there were some issues earlier with the chat, but everything should be enabled now, so you should be able to add your questions in there. While folks are getting those questions in there, I'm gonna throw out a few of my own questions for Jeff and David. Jeff, you had mentioned Polestar coming into the US. Are some of these European brands that are now owned by Chinese companies, whether that's Polestar, Volvo, maybe MG? Is that kind of the easiest route that you'd see for Chinese automakers starting to enter the US market, given the already existing name recognition, familiarity with US standards, and, existing dealership networks and things like that? Would that be kind of the easiest route for them to enter the US market?
I think that's probably right, at least in my opinion, as long as you can figure out the tariff issue. And you can figure it out in a variety of different ways, right? You can do what Polestar seems to have announced it's doing, where they're going to be producing Polestar branded vehicles at Volvo's facility in South Carolina. If you make the vehicle in the United States, obviously there's no tariff to be paid. And in instances like that, Andy, I mean, you mentioned the dealer network, which David and I didn't touch on, but I think that's a really beneficial thing to not have to figure out, for lack of better words. And then in the same way that I talked a lot about existing brand recognition in Europe, I think if it's a nameplate that US companies are familiar with, or if it's a production facility that US consumers are familiar with, that has obvious benefits. If you weren't talking about that, like if we were hypothetically talking about Polestars truly just being exported from China at 27.5%, I might then have a different opinion. But again, assuming you can figure that out, whether it's via production in Mexico or via production in the United States, then I think that makes a lot of sense.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. I'm just looking at some of the questions that are coming in here in the chat. One question is, if the EU deploys a similar anti-subsidy rate that puts duties on Chinese EVs on par with the US, about 27.5%, what impact do you think it would have on Chinese EV exports to Europe? And would it, kind of reduce that quantity so it'd be more in line with the US? Do you think it would have a significant impact on their sales in Europe?
So the easy answer is yes. Make something 27% more expensive, and it'll certainly have an impact. I doubt it would have as large of an impact as you would expect, because one, the Chinese really are producing significantly cheaper vehicles. Also, we've seen responses to similar things, to Chinese response to similar tariffs on other items, where somehow they manage to maintain market share. Somehow costs seem to go down for the vehicles enough that the tariff doesn't increase the price that much. Maybe not for vehicles, but the ITC looked at 232, 301 tariffs relatively recently, and somehow Chinese automotive parts exports to the US basically maintained market share despite the addition of a 25% tariff, which I have not performed an investigation of Chinese subsidies, and I'm not saying specifically what happened, but somehow that was maintained. And so I think that the effect would certainly happen, and it might encourage a faster natural progression that you see for vehicle manufacturers, where once they gain a foothold in a market, usually over 100,000 units of sales for a specific model, they'll invest in a plant building there, which is both a economic and a political idea, because if you're producing inside the market, then you have constituents who support you, but also economically, it just starts to make more sense. And so those tariffs might accelerate that process. I know BYD actually is already opening a plant in Hungary, I think it is. So you might see that continue. But I think the cat's already out of the bag in terms of completely stopping it at this point.
Thanks, David. That's really interesting. And just to follow up on that and think about the prices a little bit, we see a lot of news articles reporting like, oh, the price of this Chinese EV vehicle is so many $1,000s. Well, that's not a vehicle sold in the US market or the European market, things like that. Do you have any kind of flavor that you could give us of a sense for like a vehicle that maybe is going into Europe, how much cheaper that is than a vehicle produced in Europe, in terms of, we're looking at kind of apples to apples comparisons of what those vehicle prices are for those Chinese vehicles?
So I have to admit to not being a European market expert, but I think a good example of something that Volvo is planning on bringing to the US market is the EX30. And they've listed that as a $30,000 small EV SUV, which the average the average cost of a vehicle sold in the US is more in the $40,000 range. For EVs, it's higher than that. So that would be significantly lower. 30,000 has really been the white whale that everyone's kind of been chasing in terms of EVs. And if the Chinese get there first, it really would have a big impact. And that I think the way that they're able to do that is that duty drawback that Jeff mentioned, that the Volvo plant will be exporting. But since it's 1-for-1, that really limits the amount that you can sell without paying tariffs. So they'd probably still have to pay tariffs if they really gain a foothold.
The other thing that I'll add to it, it's a little tough to compare import unit prices, which David had up on the slide, and like what you would pay at a dealership, because there's a markup there. The dealership has to make its profit, obviously, and that's just like a long standing. Like if you look at unit prices of US exports, you would wonder why vehicles are as expensive as they are to buy. Not that they're absurdly cheap. They're nowhere near, what China's unit prices used to be, but just like a rough estimate. I mean, David had said that the unit prices, even, as they've increased, are still $20,000+ behind like what's coming out of the United States. We're typically, historically speaking, exporters of larger vehicles. Like that's just what's more common in the United States. So to some degree there, you're comparing potentially a small car or a sports car to a pickup truck or an SUV, and that's not a great comparison. But even just thinking through, like if the unit price of what's going into Europe these days is in the high 20s of thousands of dollars, that's not wildly different than if you go buy, say, like a Bolt or something along those lines here in the US market. So I think the way to probably think about it is like the higher end of China's current offerings going into Europe are getting to the point where they're comparable to, if you want a smaller car, what you would buy in the United States.
Okay. Thanks. That's really helpful context and really important to, I think, understand the details of how these things are priced and, what the import prices are and as well how these duty drawbacks might work and thinking about that for tariffs down the road. Another question here from the chat. To what extent are China's exports being driven by Tesla alone? How does it look if you take Tesla out of the equation?
So as we mentioned, at least first half of 2023, Tesla made up about 39% of the EV exports from China. That still leaves, rough math in my head, roughly 1 million units in 2023 that they would have exported, which still would have been more than anyone else. So it is not just a Tesla story, though Tesla is a big driver. And I would imagine that unit price would start going down as well. Andy, you mentioned vehicles that wouldn't be sold in the US. The cheapest of the BYD EVs, I think sells for $14,000 in China. And so might be sold for export for a little more than that, but the unit price would be quite low for it. I think that's the Dolphin is the lowest one. The group.
Yeah, and then I'll just add the same CIS report that David's getting that 39% number from. I think last year it has Tesla at 32%. So we're still dealing with a small enough sample size here that I don't know that I would extrapolate too much, but that 39% is not just a 1-year blip. Like I think you can roughly take Chinese exports or Chinese sales and lop a third, well, Chinese exports, not Chinese sales, and lop a third off of it. And that would give you a picture of the rest of the market, relatively speaking.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful. I'm gonna turn a little bit to you mentioned the number of Mexican auto parts plants coming into Mexico by Chinese owned companies. Can you give us a little bit of sense? I know, David, you had mentioned that there were still a lot of auto parts coming into the US in spite of the 232 tariff or 301 tariffs, excuse me. Give us a sense for what role Chinese auto parts suppliers currently play in the North American supply chain. And are they supplying OEMs or is a lot of it aftermarket parts?
So historically, it was aftermarket really, even when I started, which Andy will remember this, when I started at the ITC, I was the junior person, and there were a bunch of people who'd been there for a very long time, but that has changed. And so I'm getting used to when I say when I started, it's sounding like a long time to people. It was roughly 15 years ago for the rest of you. But when I started, even then, China had really taken over the aftermarket on automotive parts, and even vehicle manufacturers had basically had to convert at least some of their sales that were going through dealerships to Chinese aftermarket parts in order to be competitive. But they have been steadily moving up the chain. There's a whole progression. One of the papers we posted there was something I wrote about 5 years ago, talked about this, that there's a whole progress that happens. It takes time for vehicle manufacturers to trust new suppliers, but with the joint venture requirements in China, all of those companies that did joint ventures in China, those joint ventures all matched the standards for GM, for Ford, for Stellantis, for BMW, and whoever. And once that supplier is able to meet the standard for the joint venture, then they're able to meet the global standard for that company. And so then they're able to start competing for global domination keeps coming into my mind. That's not what I mean, but they're starting to be able to compete globally and for global contracts. And you win a contract, and then maybe you need to invest elsewhere. Depending on what you're producing, you need to do it locally. One of the interesting things to think about in this Chinese investment automotive parts Mexico space is things where most of the content would still come from China. We've heard about this in the brakes space. Also, when you think about cast aluminum parts, several of the plants that are in Mexico will be casting parts, and likely using Chinese aluminum, which Andy will remember doing research on aluminum and the massive aluminum capacity in China. This would be a way of not only avoiding the 301 tariffs, probably also the 232 tariffs, by investing in a plant in Mexico that casts it. It wouldn't get around the USMCA requirements because cast aluminum does casting with non-North American aluminum does not confer origination. So you wouldn't be able to get duty free into the United States. But going from 27.5% or higher to 2.5% is pretty good.
So I'm going to read this question's a little bit on the policy side, and then I'm gonna kind of read it as it's kind of here, and then I'll reframe it a little bit. What kind of policies could the U.S. enact to combat Chinese EV expansion, especially given the recent investigations being conducted by the DOC? So we talked a little bit about tariffs and things like that, and how that may kind of prevent vehicles from entering the U.S. market. What other kind of current barriers are there out there to Chinese vehicles? Do you see the companies being able to meet U.S., putting aside the European brands we discussed, do you see the other companies kind of being able to meet U.S. safety and regulation standards, being able to build that dealer network, do you see brand recognition? We talked a little bit about the Japanese and the Korean experiences coming in. So what other barriers are there out there now for U.S. or for Chinese auto companies coming into the U.S. market?
So first, I want to highlight a policy that's already in place. Many of you are aware of the Inflation Reduction Act. Those specific incentives include a requirement that for the consumer incentive, there's a requirement that none of the critical mineral or battery components come from what's phrased a foreign entity of concern, which is Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, I think, are the four right now, which really, when it comes to electric vehicles, that's really a China rule right now. And so that isn't a policy that is making sure that the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act are not going to Chinese companies. And it was pretty complicated to unravel. There's a notice of proposed rulemaking that was put out by the DOE kind of detailing to what extent FEOC involvement is what is owned, directed, whatever. It gets really complicated, but it's especially complicated because of how much Chinese are in that supply chain. But like you said, there are a number of other things that make it challenging for new entrants to come into the U.S. market. I would start by talking about emission standards, but that's not an issue for EVs. But safety standards are a real challenge. Not only does the US have high safety standards, they're actually different than the European standards. We primarily use a self-certification system and have standards that focus on can you meet this safety concern, like if the vehicle flips over, how much force causes the roof to be crushed. And the US standard doesn't specifically say you need to have A-pillars of this thickness or this requirement or whatever to prevent that. It just says you need to prevent it. The European standards are what's called type certification. And so that's going to have a specific, here's a few solutions. You have to use one of these. If you want to use a different one, you need to get the European safety regulator to approve that specific type. And so, and the way that the testing occurs is a little different. In general, they get to a similar level of safety. There's some things that the US requirements are safer on, some things that the European ones are, but they're different. One of the other big ways they're different is European safety tests buckle in their dummies and the US doesn't. So there are certain things where you can have a different shape inside the vehicle because you don't expect someone to go flying out of the vehicle. Whereas with the US standards, you need to have padding up higher because of the possibility with an unbuckled dummy that they would fly out of the vehicle. Anyway, so all of those things make it a whole set of challenges that even if you're meeting European rules, that doesn't mean you can enter the US market. And then, like you said, dealer networks cost a lot of money. You have to convince a bunch of different small businesses that they want to pay money to become one of your dealers, and then they want to invest in the land and the space and purchasing, because dealers purchase the vehicles from the vehicle manufacturer, usually on some sort of a loan, and then are selling them to the public. So that's a real challenge. Some of the EV startups in China have been using more of a Tesla setup where they don't have a dealer network and instead are selling directly, which does at least get you over that hurdle, but you still, like you said, you need brand recognition. And so in China, they have followed a similar path to Tesla with having stores that people can go to and check out the vehicles. And some of those actually involve a membership where you can continue to visit the store to charge your car and stuff like that.
And then I'll give one more thing on safety standards, and then I have another thought as well. But it's just important to understand, like, this might be for someone who has never thought of it before. You might just go, okay, well, if the safety standards are written down somewhere, then obviously you could follow them. But like this is often a real sticking point. Part of the Chorus Agreement, RFTA, with Korea was mutual recognition of safety standards between the two parties for at least a certain number of vehicles that could be exported from one market to the other. It was a documented potential sticking point for TTIP when the US-EU FTA was still on the table. This is a real concern for people who are exporting into the opposite market and have never done so before. I think it's incredibly unlikely that there would be Chinese production at a Chinese factory that is produced to meet US federal motor vehicle safety standards. Again, like whether or not you invest in the US market, whether you use a joint venture like Polestar and Volvo are doing, like those are potential ways around it. But the idea that there'd be vehicles coming off a production line in Shanghai or Beijing where half of them meet our standards and half of them meet European standards would be pretty unprecedented. And then the other thing that I think is worth talking about is I feel like a lot of the media coverage of the Mexico investment often ignores one or multiple of a few different things. So one, as David mentioned earlier, with USMCA, it seems very unlikely that those vehicles would qualify from jump. again, 2.5% is significantly better than 27.5% in terms of tariffs. So maybe that's not an insurmountable problem, but specifically with regards to the labor value content rules, where a certain portion of the vehicle needs to have been produced by high wage labor, that's typically where the US or Canadian part of the North American supply chain comes into play. So the idea that a good produced in Mexico that's presumably using more of the Chinese supply chain would have that 45% that meets that high wage threshold seems really unlikely. And I feel like we often have these news coverage pieces that come out that are like, China is going to be able to export duty free from Mexico, or that vehicles are going to be so inexpensive that you don't care about the tariff. And the example that's often thrown around is like, if you have a $10,000 car, then a 2.5% tariff means you still only have a $12,500 car, which sounds really appealing in principle. But even then, I mean, we've kind of gone over this a couple times in here, but the $10,000 car is probably just not a vehicle that's in high demand in the United States, whether it's a really low mileage threshold, whether it's just altogether like a smaller vehicle, which, as I mentioned earlier, is not what is the predominantly popular part of the US automotive industry. I think there would be a couple of different things that China would need to overcome to make a vehicle that meets our rules, is affordable, and is desirable.
Great. Thanks, David and Jeff. I think we're coming up on time. Thanks to everyone who asked questions. I know there are some we didn't get to on national security designations and things like that. I think that's a very timely issue. Certainly maybe something that the ITC can't really weigh in on as much in terms of the of what national security policies we should have going forward. But I think certainly thank you, appreciate the question, and certainly something folks can be thinking about as we move forward. With that, I want to thank Jeff and David for a wonderful presentation. It's really interesting and really helpful to get into the depth of these issues and see kind of what's, there's a lot of surface discussion going on around there, but really understanding behind the scenes, the trends in the data, those other factors that people may not be thinking about for Chinese firms trying to enter the US market, how they may enter, what are some of the barriers they may face, things like that. So I think it's been a really fascinating discussion. We will, a reminder for folks, we'll post this on our YouTube page afterwards for anyone who wants to view the presentation, and we'll upload the slides as well to our website following the presentation. Again, thanks, David and Jeff, for the presentation, and thanks to everyone for joining today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.